Okay, so thank you for coming and watching this. Please do type in the comments at the same time. I'll kind of, when I look this way, I'm looking at the comments. When I look this way, I'm looking at my slides. I'll also be live coding at the same time. Well, semi-live coding, copying and pasting some code I've written before. So you'll see that as we go. So this talk is on modeling epidemics with Python, and my name is Vince Knight. I'll say a little bit more about myself in a couple of slides. In the chat, I've pasted. There's a link that is being pinned to a GitHub directory with my slides, but probably more usefully the Jupyter notebook that I'm essentially going to be writing as we go. So if you want to take a look at that, please do. So before talking about myself, I want to talk about who I am not. So I am not the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Okay, since the outbreak of COVID-19, on Twitter, in family conversations throughout the world, there are a lot of people that have all of a sudden become epidemiologists. So a lot of people, for example, who should have no opinion on the efficacy of masks now have one, and various other things. So this talk is at no way meant to make you an epidemiologist, all right? What I am going to do in this talk is just go over some basic models of how this the various graphs we've seen in the news are obtained. I will purposefully not use COVID-19 data. So I'm kind of big disclaimer, this is kind of the theory and how this works. But by watching this talk, you are not an epidemiologist. You are not an expert. I mean, you might be an expert, but it's not thanks to this talk, okay? So my mathematical expertise is not epidemiology. I am not an epidemiologist. So listen to the experts, listen to the science. If you take only one thing from this talk, take that. Hope you'll take a couple of other things, but if you take only one thing, take that. But a bit about myself. So I'm a mathematician at Cardiff University. That's this top left logo there. Cardiff is in Wales in the UK, and you'll see our logo actually has, it's bilingual. So on the top it says Cardiff University, and underneath it says Prifysgol Caerdydd. That's hopefully not too bad a pronunciation. So I'm a mathematician there, and the favorite part of my job is I get to teach all our undergraduates. And so I teach generally two things. I teach programming, so I get to teach 180 first-year students every year how to use Python, and that's probably one of the things I enjoy doing the most. And then I also teach our final year students, I teach them game theory, which is my area of expertise. On the right there, there's a logo meant to represent my role in the UK Python Association, which is the charity that puts on PyCon UK every year and does some smaller other things. And so I'm one of the people that helps run the yearly PyCon UK. The icon on the bottom left is meant to represent my open source software contributions. So that's actually the logo for a library called the Axelrod library, which is a game theoretic library that allows you to do agent-based modeling of prisoner dilemma situations. And I plan for everything except for my cat deciding that she needed to join. This is Chick, and she's going to be a little pain. And the Axelrod library is actually quite a mature library now. It's 5 years old, 6 years old, something like that. And it what's quite neat about it is that the first lines of it were actually written in Africa. They were written in Windhoek, Namibia. And then the final logo on the bottom right there, that's the logo for the Software Sustainability Institute, which is an institute in the UK that aims to ensure research software is well written. And so very, very loosely, research software is not always written to a high standard. Research as a result of that is not often is often not reproducible. And so the SSI, of which I'm one of many fellows, aims to kind of improve the overall quality of research software. And so that's another thing that I'm particularly interested in. One of the other things I just wanted to mention incredibly briefly is that I've been lucky enough to attend, up until 2018, I believe, including 2018, all of the PyCon Namibias. And so I don't know how clear this photo is on the screen right now, but one of the things about PyCon Namibia, which is taking place in Windhoek every year, that makes it very, very special, is the row of people at the back, which are the high school students, the learners who get to attend that, and that makes it a very special conference. And it's one of the things about PyCons throughout the world. Every national PyCon or continental PyCon has a thing that makes it kind of unique. They all have this common thread that make them PyCons, but they have these things that make them unique. And so this slide is both meant to kind of say hello to any friends from Namibia. I haven't been able to attend the last two PyCon Namibias because I've had a son, and so he's not quite ready to go. But we're looking. I can't wait to take him and visit PyCons in Africa when he's a little bit older. But also to kind of say just a huge well done to the organizers of this PyCon Africa. I've really enjoyed the conference. It's actually one of my first-ish virtual conferences. I think it's been fantastic. I think the talks have been fantastic. But it has also had something special about it that has made it PyCon Africa. So well done to the organizers. Okay, now to kind of move on to some of things that we're here for. So when what we're essentially aiming to do when we model a pandemic is take the real world, build a mathematical model of it, and gain some information. Okay. And so what you see here, you might remember or you might have seen before, I should say. This is the basic idea behind Fibonacci, the Fibonacci sequence. So Fibonacci, supposedly the story behind the Fibonacci sequence is he wanted to know, if I have one pair of rabbits this month, how many pairs of rabbits will I have in the future? And he made a very simple, a number of incorrect, weak assumptions, strong assumptions about the real world, in that rabbits don't die, a pair of rabbits makes a new pair of rabbits every year, et cetera, et cetera. And according to those assumptions, this sequence of numbers appeared. And the Fibonacci sequence comes up relatively often for programmers because it's a really nice way to write a recursive function. So if I write, if I define a Python, let me make this bigger. If I define a Python function that if n is in 0, 1, returns 1, otherwise return the Fibonacci Fibonacci number of the previous n plus the one before that, we can then do something like this. And so we get that Fibonacci sequence. And a slight aside, this is actually one of the reasons I think Python is such a wonderful language, and specifically for mathematicians, is that a lot of the time when you're writing down Python code, you are writing down what could almost be mathematical notation if we just chosen a slightly different notation. So a lot of Python translates really well to mathematicians, which for my line of work is incredibly helpful. By the way, I'm going to kind of have my slides and my Jupyter Notebook next to each other at this resolution, so to speak. So just comment if it's not terribly helpful. The code should probably be the most helpful thing. And so that's the general idea behind mathematical modeling. You have a real world situation, so the growth of rabbits. You then have a model for it, which is this thing here. This is the model. And then, so that writing down the mathematical equation is the model. And then solving that model, using that model, or whatever we want to say. And that's what I'm doing here with Python on the right, is actually being able to use it. Okay. Of course, you can come back to the fact that this particular model is not great. It assumes rabbits don't die, so it's not the best model. Another slight example. I don't know how well you can see this. Hopefully it's okay. But that's meant to be a picture of a car on a road. And if you think of driving from some point to another point, and you know it takes, say, 10 miles from point A to point B, and you know that you have made 3.5 miles worth of a journey, and you're interested in how much further you have to go, this would be the same type of mathematical procedure you'd do, right? So you have a real world situation, and the real world problem is you want to know how much further you have to drive, and what you do is you write down the mathematical model, which in this case is this very simple function, 3.5 plus x equals 10. And then you get information for that, of how much further you need to go. You solve that equation. You just take 3.5 away from 10. Of course, we wouldn't do that in that simple situation, but that is akin to the whole idea of a mathematical model. And in both of these situations, what I've written down is an equation. I've written down the Fibonacci equation. I've written down that incredibly simple 3.5 plus x equals 10 equation. And what our equations are there are relationships between quantities and other quantities, okay? So 3.5 miles and 10 miles is our relationship there. Number of rabbits at this stage in time versus number of rabbits at previous stages in time. But if we had a slightly different question, our equation and our mathematical model would have to be slightly different. So let's say that I had driven not 3.5 miles, but 3.5 meters, yards, something much shorter, and I realize there's a wall in front of me at a total of 10 meters from my starting point. And so now I want to know, how soon can I stop? So brakes on the car, will I or will I not hit the wall at the 10 meter mark, okay? And now if you start thinking about this, what's on the slide there, that you've driven 3.5 meters and you have a total of 6.5 meters to go, that's not enough information, okay? Quantities alone will not do here, because really what we need to know is how fast is the car going, okay? That's the only way we'll be able to know whether or not we're gonna hit that wall. And that kind of brings on to another type of equation, one that relates quantity to speed, okay? And so how many meters we've done, then we need to know the relationship to the speed of the car at the time, at that point in time. Some of us might remember some physics, some Newtonian physics, or some mechanics, again, Newtonian mechanics, in which case you realize what I'm perhaps talking about here. But if you don't remember those things, don't worry, it's not terribly important. Just know that the general kind of idea from where we were before of relating quantities to other quantities, we're now moving a slight step of that, relating quantities to speeds. And if you think about our car, once we start braking, our speed goes down, right? So as we are going further and further along, the speed of the car is going lower and lower and lower, and then eventually we stop once we have no more speed. And so really what we want to know is this point here before or after the wall. But what we've got here is a straight line going down, and it might be clear that when you do put the brakes on a car or a bicycle or just on yourself as you try to stop walking, how fast you slow down might itself change over time. You might be slowing down quite slowly at the start and then slowing down quite drastically, all right? If you think about when you're learning to ride a bike, I remember when I kind of learned to ride a bike and was able to ride a bike, one of the first things I did was ride down a hill, hit the front brake, and fall over and hurt myself. I was fine. But now I know that when I ride a bike, I should use the back brake at first to slow down slowly, and then once I've slowed down sufficiently, I brake so that I don't go flying over the handlebars. So we're not always going to be slowing down at the same rate. Okay, so we've got speed, and we've got the speed at which we reduce speed. And so our slowdown might look something like this. So it might have a curve where it slows down kind of slowly and then speeds up. It could be a slightly different curve. That's not terribly important. But what's important to know is that that curve is interesting. Okay. And what we really want to know is what is the curve of the curve. If we put a flat line of it, what is that rate? And at a given point, can I know how fast I'm going to slow down? All right. What will be my deceleration? That's what we're talking, or negative acceleration. And this is called in mathematics the derivative. And the derivative is a fantastic tool. It's essentially the basis of calculus. And to think about it loosely, the way you calculate the derivative on a curve like this is you look at that curve, you take 2 points on it, and you draw the line between them. And you take those 2 points and you move them closer and closer and closer together until they're essentially at the same spot, and then that gives you the deceleration. And so that derivative is an important quantity. It tells us a lot about the car, or the quantity that we want to study. So if you think about a coffee break, please don't leave and go on a coffee break now. But if you think about a coffee break, which is not something the organizers have had to worry about too much, but if you think about a coffee break at a conference, you want your coffee to be there on time, and you don't want it to cool down too much. You can't just put all your coffee out at the beginning of the day for all the coffee breaks. You need to put your coffee out, but you don't want it necessarily there too late, because it'll be too hot to drink. That's maybe a slight exaggeration, but I, for one, am someone that doesn't like to drink my coffee too hot. I like it relatively cool. And so we can write down an equation that describes the way a cup of coffee cools down. Okay, cup of tea, cup of boiling water, whatever. This equation will be of this second type of equations that relates quantity to speed. And the equation will look like this. What we've got on the left there, d big T, d little t. So the big T is the temperature, and the little t is time. That's that derivative. So on that left-hand side of the equation, that's the speed. That's the speed at which the coffee cup changes temperature. Then what it relates to is the difference between the overall temperature and so the room temperature and the temperature at a given point in time. So if our coffee cup is hotter than the temperature in the room, so this is higher than that, then this whole quantity here is negative, right? If temperature in the room is 30 degrees and my coffee cup is 100 degrees, my cup of coffee is 100 degrees, and then I've got a minus 70 here, which means that the speed of my change of temperature is negative, which means that my cup of coffee is going down. If my cup of coffee was lower than the room temperature, it would slowly increase, okay? And that's our model. That is the model of a cup of coffee cooling down. It's actually called Newton's law of cooling. So this was an equation that Newton came up with. And we can play with this using Python. So what we're going to do that is use a fantastic Python library called Sympy. And Sympy is a Python library that allows you to do symbolic mathematics. So for example, if I create a Sympy object, which is a symbol called t, I can now do things like say, what is t plus t? It says it's 2t, and various other things like that. So we can then write down, I'm just copying and pasting this from my other notebook. We can write down, if I go back one slide, Newton's second law of cooling, Newton's law of cooling, pardon me. I have to do some things like create a symbolic function, create the symbols that I have, and then write down this equation. And so the equation has a left-hand side, which is the derivative of t with respect to t, and the right-hand side, which is just exactly what we have there. And if I define those things, I rebooted my system before speaking. So I was like, oh, I just want to make sure that, you know, any gremlins that are going to make my Wi-Fi slower aren't there. And so there we go. We see that equation. By the way, one thing that Sympy does with the Jupyter Notebook, it actually uses LaTeX on the back end to render everything, so it looks pretty. And then what we can do is we can solve this differential equation using a Sympy function called dsolve for differential equation solve, I believe. Pass in an initial condition, ICS for initial conditions, which is that the temperature at time t equals 0 is 100. So that kind of goes back to the car slowing down. You can write down a differential equation that describes the car slowing down, but to actually know something about it, you need to know the speed at a particular point in time. And then we can just take some other things. So for example, I'm going to substitute in a value for K. What the value actually is not terribly important, and a temperature for the room. And now we have this particular solution. Okay, I've taken the right-hand side of my equation, so just this part, and substituted in some values, and I've got that particular solution. And now we can plot this using Matplotlib and a bit of NumPy just to make my code ever so slightly simpler. And so all I'm doing there is creating a bunch of time points, so creating 500 values of t, substituting them all in, and here I'm just going to plot them. And what we see over time is that the cup of coffee is cooling down. And so if I wanted to drink my coffee at, I don't actually know what temperature I like my coffee at. I know I just don't like it too hot, but let's say 50 degrees, I should wait about 10 minutes for my cup of coffee to cool down. Right, so with those things in mind, that we have a real world situation and we can write down an equation that relates speed to quantity, which is the type of thing we have here, and then we can use Python to solve it and gain information from it. We're now going to move on to pandemics. And so what you've got on the screen there is something called the well, it's a diagram of something called the SIR model. And we're basically going to make modifications to this as we go. But you think of the general population as susceptible to a disease, okay? And they get infected at a rate alpha. So at a rate alpha, you jump from S to I. And then at a rate beta, you recover. So from being infected, you recover. That's again a model, a conceptual model, in the same way that Fibonacci said that rabbits just keep on going and going and going. That's a simplistic model of how a disease works through a population. But once we have that, we can write down equations that describe it. So the speed of S is going to be negative because everyone's going to get this disease and become infected. It's related both to the number of infected and the number of susceptibles, because if there's no one that's infected, no one will get infected. The rate of infections goes up by the same rate that the number of susceptibles goes down, and it goes down by the rate at which you recover. Okay, so you have those three differential equations. And so now we would be within our rights to assume that we can aim to get something similar to this. Okay, that we can use Sympy to obtain an equation like this that tells us the value of S, I, and R at a given point in time. And so if we were to do that, this would be the code to do it. So we'd create three functions, SIR, that would be functions, create a number of symbols, create these three equations, and dsolve is written in such a way that it can take systems of these differential equations. And if you were to run that, Sympy essentially goes through all the implemented algorithms for solving differential equations and says, we don't really know how to solve this one. Now, that is not unsurprising. Solving the SIR model analytically, in other words, getting that closed form solution where we can just plug values of t into it, is actually very hard. There's a paper, and you can find the link to it in the notebook that I've linked to, that goes over that for a particular case, and it's a hard equation to solve. But the good news is we can actually solve it doing something else. We don't need to have this expression here. We don't even need to care if it's possible to get it, because we can very, very quickly get Python to build the solution for us. So what I'm pasting in there is the mathematical representation of these three equations. So again, similarly to the Fibonacci sequence that we saw at the start, where I could write down the mathematics of the Fibonacci sequence and then I could code it up. This is all I'm doing here. I've got these three differential equations, and what they give is the derivative. So it takes an element x, and x will be an array of our three values, s, I, and r, and then it just returns a 3 array again, which will just be minus alpha times I times s, alpha times I times s minus beta times I, and beta times I, okay? And so with that, we can obtain the derivative at any given point in time if we need to. So for example, if x was 1, 10, and 0, so we had 1 susceptible member of the population, 10 infected, no recovers. If our alpha was 1 out of 1,000 and our beta was 1 out of 5, what would be the derivatives at that point in time? Okay, so we'd see that the rate at which the recovers is changing would actually be a very high positive number because there's none in there yet, everyone from infected, so someone's going to recover relatively quickly. So that's useful. And then in the same way that with the Fibonacci sequence, once I've written down the function that coded up the recursive rule, I could just use a for loop to go through it. Here we essentially need the equivalent of that for loop. But that equivalent needs a little bit more work. And so we need to do something called numerical integration. And so what we're going to use is Scipy. And so Scipy is a wonderful Python library that has, it's kind of like the Swiss Army knife of Python, of scientific Python libraries, because it has a little tool for everything. When someone asks me, hey, Vince, how do I do this specific mathematical thing in Python? More or less the first thing I think of, if it's a relatively kind of utility thing, is Scipy will have it. And so what Scipy does is it essentially steps through, in the same way that I did with that recursive function, essentially steps through our equation, calculating the derivative of every stage, adjusting the lines on our graphs, and making another step. That's very loosely what it does. And the way it works is you call it, you pass it the function that defines the derivatives, which is that dx that I defined up here. You pass an initial condition. So you pass it what our original population is. So in this particular example, I'm saying, imagine we have a population of 1,000 individuals. We have 999 susceptible people, 1 infected, and 0 recovered. In other words, we have the first case. We need a bunch of t's. I kind of glossed over this in our definition of dx, that dx needs to take a t. That's because theoretically our derivatives could also change over time. In our particular case here, they don't. They just change based on the quantities. But theoretically, we could say that the rate of which the disease spreads changes dependent on the season, for example. So with COVID, there was a lot of hope that in the warmer climates, that our transmission rates would go straight down. And then we also pass whatever extra arguments go to the function. So in our particular case, the alpha and the beta. And so if I run that, and if I just take a look at x, what I have is an array of arrays. And that first NumPy array is that original population, which is just the one I gave it, 999, 1, and 0. And then over time, we see what's happened, okay? And that in itself is an incredibly powerful bit of Python toolkit. Scipy.integrate.od, and just lets you do so much. And so we want to visualize those things, because as is, it's not terribly useful. And there you go. That is the disease. That is a model of the pandemic, of a pandemic, an epidemic. Over time, what we see is our population starts out by being nothing but a population of susceptible individuals. Those susceptible individuals slowly go down as the number of infected goes up. But as the number of infected goes up, so do the number of people that are recovered. And then once we get to this peak, and again, if you've been watching the news over the past, feels like years, but months, that peak is very important. We're going to talk about that peak a little bit more. Once we get to that peak, then all of a sudden, there are no more infected people to infect, because we've infected all the people and everyone's recovered. Some of you might be asking, what does recovered mean? And I'll come back to that later. But at the moment, recovered is just a lovely mathematical term for not susceptible and not infected. And now with this model, what we can start doing is kind of ask questions of the effect of that alpha. Okay, so all I'm going to do is just essentially put that same code inside a loop and try out 6 different values of alpha between 0 and 1/200. And I'm just calling that same function I'm plotting over time as we go. And what we see here is that if alpha is 0, okay, so there's basically no transmission, then our curve of infected, I'm only plotting the infected on this graph, by the way. Our curve of infected people basically doesn't change because no one gets infected. But then as alpha increases, our peak gets higher. And this alpha is a numeric value for that infection. And it's multiple things: the disease itself, how much we interact, how easy it is to spread when we interact. Now, some of those things we can't control, like how easy a disease is to spread when we interact. Does the disease spread even if we're wearing masks and we stay away from each other? And if it did and it was incredibly virulent, then that's a bad thing. Or does it only spread, you know, if we're really close and we're speaking right at each other's face? That's a representation of alpha, and we can't really control that. That's that part of alpha is inherent to the biological disease itself. But things we can control is how much we get into contact with other people. Okay, so and another example of this is, for example, with sexually transmitted diseases. One way we control their spread is through education programs of being safe, essentially. But what we could see here, and for example, what someone in government would do when they're coming up with policy, is they'd look at this graph and they'd look at these alphas and they'd go, well, you know what? Our hospital only has 500 ICU beds. And so if we're in one of these graphs, the green, the red, the purple, or the brown graph, then our hospital could not cope with it. However, if we can get to this orange graph, then we'll be under 500 and our hospital could at least cope with it. So that peak would be spread over time and would be less likely to have it. And so this alpha here is essentially made up of many things, including the R0 rate that we've been hearing a lot about in the news. Okay, and the R0 rate is the component of alpha that we can control. That we can't control, but we try and control by reducing how much we mix. And so what you see on this graph is that effect of social distancing. So I'm going to very briefly go through some of the models. I won't put up the Python code for it because of time, and I don't like speaking for too long. But what we could then do is add in something we don't actually know with COVID, for example, that once we're infected, whether or not we have immunity. So we can add that into the model. We can say, what happens if once you're infected, some of the time you become recovered in that you're no longer infected or susceptible, or what happens if you go back to the susceptible population. And you just modify the differential equation slightly, okay? And again, in the notebook I linked to, you can see links to all those things. We could also model a vaccination. What happens if we skip the infection and just make all of our population relevant to this disease recovered? How does that affect things? And then one of the final things we can do is I keep on talking about recovered, but recovered mathematically just means you're not susceptible or infected. However, it could mean you're dead. So, and that's not funny. I don't know why I was laughing there. I'm just perhaps a bit nervous. What we can, however, do is incorporate in our model a difference between recovered in that you're recovered and healthy and you're recovered and dead, okay? And we just do that by adding that extra little parameter where P becomes the probability of recovering from the disease and no longer and living, where so 1 minus P is the probability that you recover from the disease and are not living. The differential equations just modified slightly, and the main thing is that we have 4 of them. But fundamentally, the code, as you can see if you click on my notebook, well, actually, let me go get that code for that final one. The code is no more complicated. There's a long doc string there, but it's essentially just these differential equations that I've written. And really, these differential equations, the right-hand side, once you've written down the picture and you have that model, the conceptual model, you can write that down relatively straightforwardly. And so solving it, this code is essentially the same as all the one we've seen before. I have to modify it slightly because now my arrays, my population is defined by 4 numbers, because my recovered are now being split into 2. And I just use this scipy.integrate.ode. It's an incredibly powerful function. And so if we have a kappa of a quarter, so the kappa here means that a quarter of people, when they get sick and recover, they are still susceptible for the disease. If we vaccinate nobody, and if your probability of surviving an infection is 0.85, this is what that would look like. We'd have a fair amount of deaths, but it'd be relatively low, a really high peak of infection. And so if we vaccinated at a very fast rate, this will change substantially. We've essentially gotten rid of that infected bump. There are still some people that got infected, but fundamentally the vaccine is what really changes things. And that's the importance of why we need to get a vaccine for COVID. So I'll start kind of summarizing here. I've spoken about 2 bits of Python. So Sympy, an amazing library. Sympy is a fantastic library that allows you to do symbolic mathematics. And so since using Sympy, there's a few papers that myself and some PhD students of mine have written where we know the results are right, not just because we've checked them and are hopefully somewhat correct, somewhat capable mathematicians, but we've also used Sympy to do the mathematics on top of what we've done. So Sympy is a wonderful library. But there are some things that it can't necessarily do, and frankly, you don't even want it to do. So when you want to solve these differential equations, you don't necessarily, for this type of work, need to solve them exactly, in which case you have this numerical integration. And then the general kind of idea that I've hopefully gotten across in this talk is that when you're doing applied mathematics, you have this little triangle between the real world, your model of the real world, and the insights you can gain from the model. And sometimes those insights are perfect, sometimes you need a bit of work. And frankly, this triangle is a cycle. You're constantly going back to the real world, realizing that your insights can be changed, realizing that your model can be changed. And that's not just applied mathematics, that's science. When new evidence turns up, science updates itself. And that's what this trifactor is about. If you take 2 things from this talk, the first one being that I'm not Anthony Fauci, and you're probably not too, I doubt he has time to watch this talk, is this graph here, and that the real thing that controls what that peak does is our effective social distancing. If you do have any questions, I'd be delighted to take them. If you want to get in touch with me, I'm drvinceknight on Twitter, on GitHub, and a couple of other places. My website, where you can find a link to this talk and various other things, is up there. And if you want to email me, please do. And just a final thank you to all the other speakers. I've really enjoyed being able to see your talks. Amazing congratulations to the organizers. Putting on a conference like this is not easy in normal times. I don't doubt it's even harder at the moment. So well done. And yes, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. But it's okay if you don't have any. My pleasure, Marnie. My pleasure. Okay, Daniele, I've seen your question. Yeah, so Daniele, I'm just gonna read out your question for those that can't see it. Daniele, that's a very good question. So yes, I was careful to kind of say I'm not doing a COVID talk. because I think it's important in these times to be aware of the boundaries of one's own expertise. And I am not an epidemiologist, so I'm listening to epidemiologists. But so then you're asking that despite that, have I done any COVID modeling, or was I tempted to? If not, and if you did I conclude anything? So no is the very short answer, but I'll try and give an answer that's perhaps more interesting than that. I was not tempted to. I was very happy just looking at the insights of the models. I think perhaps as a mathematician that understands some of these things, I perhaps could look at these models with some understanding of what was being done behind the scenes. But I don't necessarily need that. I think in a lot of cases, actually, the modeling has been communicated fairly well. If you did want to do this, what you'd need to do is find out what the alpha, the beta, and various other parts of your models are. So if I just go back to this plot here, this picture here, you need to find out parameters for the alpha, the beta, the kappa, and the p. So I remember when COVID first appeared, people were saying, I think that the death rate for the general population was 3%. I have no doubt that that's been changed, and that's the type of thing you would be able to put in here. And going back to this constant cycle of going through things, you'd be updating that as you go. Something else you could do is compartmentalize this model even further, because there are at-risk populations, at-risk sections of our populations, and so you could not just have S, but S of a given age, S of a given body type, S people who are diabetic or not, and various other risk factors. So you could do all that. And then the final part of your question was, if I had done that, would I have concluded anything? I very much suspect I would conclude the same things that we're seeing reported by the scientists. But things that you could do is kind of convince yourself to the effectiveness of that distancing. You could say, well, what if people are doing this? What if people are doing that? And you could get those answers fairly quickly. So I'm not sure if that's a completely satisfying answer, Daniele. Thanks for being here, by the way, Daniele. Thank you for watching my talk. So yeah. And thanks for the others who are saying nice things. And thanks for being here, everyone. I appreciate the audience. And if anyone has any further questions after this, just I'm very happy for you to get in touch with me. My Jupyter Notebook's up on GitHub. You can take a look at that as well if that's helpful. Yeah. But in the spirit of a PyCon, Python has the tools to do all these things, and that numerical integrator really is a fantastic implementation. Nick, you asked me, will you be writing a nice blog post introducing SIR with Python? That's not a bad idea, Nick. That's not a bad idea. So I will do that. And Nick, I hear that you've recently gotten your PhD. So I don't know if any of our African friends are watching that don't know that, but congratulations, Nick, on successfully getting your PhD. You did a fantastic job. Kojo, thanks for putting it for online. I'm sure I'll have to look at it again. Well, if you have any questions, Kojo, when that happens, please don't hesitate to get in touch. I don't have anything off the top of my head, Prajwal, about a blog or link to. I can send a link actually to an example paper that I've. Well, actually, let me go get that right now. So one of the courses I teach, my first year programming course, I get students to write a research paper on something, and what I do is I provide them with some example work, and what I'm just pasting on here is one such example, which is for the the SIR model. That is in no way the source of truth you should look at for the SIR model, but it's off the top of my head. That's one document I know I have. I'm pretty sure if you Google things, you'd be able to find a lot, although perhaps not all good things. But the SIR model is the starting point. There are a lot more sophisticated models of epidemics that exist. that really take into account the population structure, right? If everyone knows everyone, like for example in a school, then that disease will spread a lot. And again, in a school, if you think about it, the individuals that are really vital in that network. Oh, I've forgotten the name of the speaker. I feel terrible. The previous speaker on the Rubik's Cube gave a really cool talk, but that graph, you have these model, Dustin, thank you, Nicoletta. Dustin gave a really cool talk about the Rubik's Cube using graph theory and networks. And they're all models of epidemics that use networks. And if you think about a school, the nodes in that network that are really, really important are the teachers, because the teachers interact with everybody, okay? Whereas if you think of a really, really sparse network, so if you just think about a street where you might only interact with your neighbor on the right and on the left, that disease spread is going to be different. So there are more sophisticated models than the SIR model. I have zero doubt that the models that are being used at the highest governmental levels and by the WHO are more sophisticated than the SIR model. However, in aggregate, I would be interested to know how much more insightful they are. I feel like I've just rambled. Hopefully I've answered your some questions there. Oh, Prashwal, so you've read through one of those references. That's cool. That's very cool. So I have a feeling that's it. I'm happy to stick around. I'm delighted if anyone else wants to talk about this or anything else. But yeah. Yeah, Daniele, that's so Daniele has asked another question that these type of ideas could be used to model other things like the spread of knowledge. Yeah, it's a really good idea. So I believe I once went to a talk at a conference where they were using these models to look at religion, but also to look at languages, and specifically looking at the Welsh language in Wales, and seeing if the language essentially survives or not. I again forget the name of a speaker. Someone gave a really neat talk about natural language processing, and they were from South India, and they spoke about applying it. I'm loosely remembering, so forgive me if you're in the audience. Applying it to, they use natural language processing to create translation for smaller languages. Languages are not English, I should say, not smaller. Languages are not English. And so that would be similar. You could build a model like this to see what sort of interventions you could do. And so coming back to Welsh, I know at some point Welsh was in danger of dying. This was decades ago, and I'm really speaking out of my knowledge here. But you could certainly build models like this that show what would happen. And in a similar way that I was able to go, well, what is the effect of a vaccine? Look, the disease dies down. You could just pop in a number, solve the model, and you could see, oh, if we start making Welsh education mandatory up to the age of 7, what would be the effect of that? And so you could definitely look at this to model transmission. Through society or transmission of rumors and things also about dangerous stories about minorities being shared on social. Yeah, absolutely, Daniele. That's a really, really good point. You could use this type of work to model the spread of false information. I suspect, however, that to model those things coherently, and this is I don't know, but this is my my hunch, is to model those things correctly. What you would really need is that I suspect that in those cases the network effect is really important, because I think what happens with false information or rumors or things like that, what starts to happen is you get this effect of the network where the network branches off and essentially creates separate networks where the information just spreads is different in subnetworks of the network. So I think you could use this, but my hunch would be for information that not everyone might want, you really need to take into account the topology of the network, as opposed to just people's ability to read that everyone wants. You'd spread that in a different way. I hope I answered your question. I always feel like I ramble sometimes. So great, yeah, Kojo, I agree, and so Kojo, you've written that it's nice to have concrete examples of things I can do in Python to help exercise my math skills. Yeah, absolutely, I completely hear that. I think something else that I try and really get across to my students who are mathematicians, right, who don't always want to learn programming, but I know when I was learning mathematics, and for example, when I learned linear algebra, which is an area of mathematics that is about using big matrices, so big squares of numbers. And I was constantly told, oh, we do these things because computers can do them efficiently. But throughout my education, I wasn't allowed, not allowed, we just didn't do it with code. We just did it all by hand. And so you're constantly told, you need to learn how to do this because computers can do it really fast. And that's what I think is so wonderful about programming for a mathematician, but for everyone, is that it's kind of that last little ingredient that you need to really have superpowers. And I fundamentally do really believe that mathematicians who can program, we can do anything. And I don't mean that in an arrogant way, or I try to not mean that in an arrogant way, but I think once you have that mathematics and then the programming actually lets you do it, that's just a real superpower. So I think what I'm saying is kind of the opposite direction of what you're saying, Kojo, that yes, it's great to have some nice maths examples to do Python, but it's also wonderful to have Python because you can make the maths come alive and make it actually useful. Again, rambling. So if I'm not mistaken, the keynote will be starting in yes, Kojo, we're in agreement. Absolutely, yeah. If I'm not mistaken, the keynote will be starting in about 5 minutes. So I guess we should leave. Thanks, Nick. Thanks for coming. Really appreciate you coming, Daniel. Thank you. I appreciate everyone taking time out to watch this. I thank you, and thank you for some really great questions, everyone. I appreciate it. Great. See everyone at the keynote. Thanks again for coming. I'm going to leave now. I don't know what happens if you stay here. Bye, everyone. Bye.